I think you can spare me the clinical, it's perfectly natural bullshit.
It was then I knew that Edward had gone to Carlisle for whatever he didn't feel comfortable speaking to Carmen about. It made sense, and though I was glad he chose to speak to anyone at all, I'd never been so confused, so I kept listening. Eavesdropping rather shamelessly for another 5 minutes taught me everything that I needed to know. Edward's last orgasm had been with me. It had been painful, excruciating. He was too embarrassed to go to a doctor, and too frightened of feeling it again to determine if it had been nothing more than a fleeting symptom of his lack of sleep and heavy drug use. I waited for their discussion to shift to something else before walking through the door. Edward's eyes were downcast as I quickly took my medication. I mumbled something about being tired, and quickly left the room, sprinting to the 3rd floor, and throwing myself on Edward's sofa. I pretended to work on my English paper while I sat in silence, but I wasn't. I was furious that he'd kept this from me all this time. I stared at the paper and my anger grew to a hot, burning pressure behind my eyes. I didn't even look up from my book when Edward entered the room, closing the door softly behind him. He stood in the middle of the room for what seemed like ages, as my eyes fixed on the page. I could see him in my periphery, regarding me, and darting his eyes around the room. His gaze seemed conflicted, as he just stood there, occasionally raking his fingers through his hair, and releasing stuttered breaths, as if he might say something, even though he didn't. Eventually, I could hear him shifting, his breathing accelerating subtly. He began, but paused. My teeth were clenched as I darted my eyes to him, taking in his rigid expression as he stared at the bathroom door, with a pale face. His lips parted with a quick inhale, as he decided with tight eyes,
I'm going to take a shower real quick.
And swallowed visibly. He lowered his head and huffed, as he walked to the bathroom, flinging the door open, and closing it a little too forcefully. Edward never showered at night. My fury grew. It swelled and pushed at the insides of my ribs, until my breaths were erratic and uncontrollable. Edward hadn't even taken clothes with him, so focused and nervous that he'd probably forgotten. Tears stung at my eyes with every second that I didn't hear the shower start. He was in there stalling. It took 27 minutes for me to hear the sounds of the tap coming on. I slammed my book and threw it onto the leather with a flat clap. I stood and paced and tugged at my hair, and stubbed my toe and growled at the bed, and how dare he. I felt possessed as I stormed into the bathroom, only belatedly thankful that he didn't even think to lock the damn thing. Steam had already begun to fog the large mirror as I stared back at myself, nostrils flared and eyes lined with red. But my fury faltered as I heard Edward's voice.
Ella?
He was behind the frosted glass, and I could only barely make out his silhouette. Something about the sound of his question, his vulnerability, and the pitch of his voice tugged my heart enough to abate the swelling of my rage. Mostly, I was just hurt. How could you? I choked, closing the door behind me. He was silent as I walked to the shower, and pressed my hand against the glass, water running down it like crystal tears. How could you keep that from me? I demanded, though it emerged as insecure and hurt as I likely felt. I sank onto the lone step by the glass door, as he remained wordless. I let the steam envelop me until the ends of my hair began coiling into random frizzes against my head. I watched the wayward sprays of his water hit the glass and slide down slowly.
You heard me talking to Carlisle, didn't you?
He accused, yet his voice was strained, and echoed oddly against the Thailand glass. Yes, I confessed, and after a moment added, you should have told me. My anger was returning with every second of his silence. Why wouldn't you tell me? I asked, my frustration seeping into my tone with hard inflections. We're supposed to work together, I finished, looking through the glass and seeking his still form. He eventually released a sigh, but remained motionless.
Bella, I can't.
How bad was it, Edward? I asked worriedly. To say I felt awful would have been an understatement. I'd never fully understood his reaction that day, as he rocked us back and forth on the edge of his bed. I'd figured he just needed some sleep. Never would I have imagined.
Bad.
He offered in a curt voice. Annoyed at his continued evasion, I prodded. And you haven't, since?
No.
I sighed, leaning my head back against the door, and fixing my eyes to the curling ends of my hair. Maybe Carlisle's right, I whispered, swallowing fretfully. If it's that bad, maybe you should just go to a doctor.
It's nothing.
He scoffed, even though his every word and action contradicted him. Then are you going to? I trailed off, my confidence wavering as my cheeks began growing hot. Realizing how stupid I was being, I rolled my eyes and blurted, are you going to jack off, or what? I could vaguely discern the shape of his arm, rising. As his head fell, his palm covering face. His mutter was a muffled,
God, please kill me.
If you want privacy, I can leave, I offered with a huff, frustrated that he refused to even discuss it with me. I now understood his inability to discuss it with a stranger, but I was so far from being one that he should have been able to. Instead, he was standing in there, ashamed and wordless. With every second he refused to speak, my anger burgeoned. The fact that I'd sacrificed my dignity in the past to have a similar conversation about my own inabilities to pleasure myself only made me feel impossibly more irate. Had we always been so off balance? Furthermore, this new realization that he felt the need to be ashamed made me feel shame about those moments for the first time ever. My resentment was palpable. In an irritated tone, he finally began.
Do you have any idea how completely fucking mortifying this?
He was cut off by the slam of my fist against the glass, the loud rattle amplified by the slick walls. My voice was incredulous as I interjected, seething, mortifying? You're telling me about mortifying? The room seemed even more silent than before as my breaths escaped in hard puffs. My fists clenched, nails sticking into my palm. Like having my boyfriend spend 3 months using a technique just to put his hands on my dis. How about losing my virginity to him and having the entire moment ruined because I couldn't handle a modicum of pain? When he still remained silent, my head shook, and I began thinking back to those months, against my will. I continued in a disbelieving voice, good God, Edward. I couldn't even say the word orgasm to you. You think I was never embarrassed, talking about stupid fucking unicorns all the time? Astonished, I chuckled, finishing, I happen to know a thing or two about being completely fucking mortified, thank you. I stood then, and swept my hair off my neck, stepping off the small platform, and walking to the door. My chest ached and bubbled, and it wasn't fair that I could show him my flaws, while he kept his hidden. He had a chance to give that back to me, to show me his, and instead, he chose to deal with it behind closed doors when I could have easily done the same and saved myself a lot of humiliation. But I was only willing to push him so far. Until he met me in the middle, and gave me the chance to accept every part of him, I was stagnant. My fingers curled around the brass knob, slick with condensation as I turned it, and prepared to leave him there alone, scared and worried. Then I heard a sharp, resounding click. I turned slowly to see the shower door cracked open, my fingers sliding off the knob.
Get in.
The mirror was almost entirely fogged when I finally stood naked in the middle of the bathroom. I looked back at my fuzzied form, and wondered why I was suddenly so nervous. I'd taken a shower with Edward before. He'd already seen every part of me, really. Somehow I felt different, though. I was skinnier now, and I knew he hated it, but my new routines at the gym made me appear more toned. I supposed I was even more attractive now than back then. I was happy with the small size of my waist, and the firmness of my few curves. I was a thin 18-year-old girl with long hair, and nice teeth. What could be so awful? My boobs got smaller when I lost weight, I remembered. I frowned as I looked down at them. The scars scattered below just felt like an extension of me now. I'd talked to Carmen about them all at length, had divulged my insecurities, and how determined I was to hide them. It was all useless. The scars were just as much a part of me as the birthmark on my calf, I eventually realized. I was in no hurry to flaunt them, but looking at them didn't make my stomach turn, like it used to. Taking a deep breath of the hot and steamy air, I decided that Edward and I had proved already how very little scars meant to one another. I rolled my eyes and padded to the shower, holding up my chin as I swung open the door, and stepped inside. I closed it behind me with the same click, and found Edward under the spray, his back to me. I swallowed as my eyes swept over him, the defined muscles of his back sharp, as the water exploded over his flattened hair. It ran down his body in clumsy streams, tracing the smooth line of his spine, and curving over the firm roundness of his ass. I watched his muscles tense as I stepped closer, the sounds of my feet smacking against the shower floor. I splayed my palm across his back, and he jerked, the water crashing and falling around his shoulders. I wrapped my arms around him and rested my cheek on his hot back, letting the water find my flesh as I diverted its path. It ran over us as though we were one body, my breasts crushed to his skin as his back rose and fell with quick breaths. But he didn't move. "Edward," I whispered, peeking my head around to see his face. He moved his hand back and flattened his palm against my thigh, but remained otherwise motionless, staring anxiously ahead. I asked quietly, "Should I?" and let one of my hands wander until I felt soft, wet hair. His breath hitched as my fingers brushed his length, the muscles of his back stiffening against my chest.
"You don't have to,"
he responded stiffly, placing his hand on my wrist and nudging it away. I sighed in annoyance but acquiesced, and waited for him to do it himself. His hand remained on my thigh, his thumb rubbing circles into my skin. And then there was this kind of awkward air. The one that occurs when you want to jack your boyfriend off to find out if it'll hurt him, but he doesn't let you, and is too chicken shit to do it himself. What exactly does one do in this position, I wondered, shifting my feet against the tile. Well, I did have a new penchant for honesty, didn't I? Stop being chicken shit, I finally sighed, even though I was inwardly panicking myself. I wouldn't let him see my own fear of causing him pain yet again. It'll be like I paused, gnawing at my lip, like ripping off a band-aid. That ejaculates.
"I'm not chicken shit,"
he insisted, but the tremble of his voice betrayed his nerves. My eyebrows rose, and I considered pointing out his blatant cowardice, but figured that wouldn't help matters any. So instead, I challenged, "Then prove it," and sought him with my hand yet again. I curled my fingers around his length, and his breathing deepened, the fingertips on my thigh twitching. My mind raced with curiosity as his only partially erect penis began growing inside my palm. His back rippled with tension, but he didn't push me away. I turned my head and rested my forehead against the space between his shoulder blades. My hand stroked him slowly from base to tip, calling forth what I remembered from our times before. His breathing accelerated as he pressed his back further into me. I couldn't tell if he was trying to get closer to my body, or farther away from my hand. I started when I felt his lathered hand wrap around mine, lacing through my fingers. It was trembling. I thought he might force me to stop. Instead he began guiding me along his length, his head falling as he released an uneven, agonized sigh. The transfer of the soap made my hand slide easier against his skin. His shaking fingers tightened around mine, setting my rhythm as his hips began shifting minutely into our palms. He tucked his chin to his chest, and I figured he was watching our fingers sliding over his erection in tandem. Wordlessly instructing me, he twisted our mutual stroke around his tip, and my own breathing began to pick up. My hips shifted with his, never allowing our skin to part, as the hot water rushed over us and splashed against our knuckles. I lifted my face to press a firm kiss against his heaving back, craving the softness of his lips, as my fingers explored him. It was then that he finally turned our skin slick against each other as he released my hand only to replace it once facing me. His idle hand cradled my cheek as I watched his fretful stare rake over my body. He gulped, eyes darting over me nervously as his fingers tightened around mine. I wasn't really nervous anymore, being seen like this. The downward hunch of his brows as he slowly resumed our stroking and stared at my chest made his desire for me evident. His thumb